In this chapter, I'll focus on some of the industrial corporations that I've found to be contaminating the environment on purpose. I've noticed that the following corporations are being used to deliberately pollute natural resources on a grand scale. Chevron, Apache Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, Enbridge, Freeport-McMoRan, Vedanta Resources, Anglo American, Rio Tinto, Canadian Natural Resources Limited, ExxonMobil, Plains All American Pipeline, Sunoco, Energy Transfer Partners, BHP Billiton, Marathon Oil, ConocoPhillips, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, Petroperu, Enyi, Antofagasta, Kinder Morgan, Valero Energy, U.S. Steel. These are only some of the biggest culprits. To speak in detail about the colossal death and destruction that these engines of ecological warfare have caused would take a series of lengthy videos. Again, the purpose of this documentary is to provide an overview. Yet, in the next segment, I'll present a profile of 7 of these corporations to give you an idea of what they're really about. At the end of this chapter, we'll observe their website material to see how much their practices differ from their public fronts and how this contrast relates to psychopathy. Here we'll have a look at the following corporations: Energy Transfer Partners, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, Rio Tinto, Anglo American. The evidence showing who founded and funds these corporations was provided in the previous chapter. Energy Transfer Partners. In the previous chapter, we saw that the top institutional holder of Kelsey Lee Warren's ETP is Stephen Schwarzman's Blackstone, and the other major holders of this corporation include banks controlled by the Morgan, Warburg, and Rothschild families. What follows are some examples of how ETP is being used to systematically destroy natural resources in the United States. During Mariner East pipeline construction, ETP subsidiary Sunoco created sinkholes in Chester and Delaware counties, Pennsylvania, by drilling into porous limestone formations that are prone to sinkholes, especially with horizontal directional drilling. The company purchased some property in Delaware County from landowners who were forced to move after sinkholes opened up in their backyard. ETP used the carrot and the stick on a community in Chester County. When seeking an easement to access their property, the company lied to residents, telling them there would be very little impact, while informing them that their land would be seized by eminent domain if they refused. So under these deceptive and threatening conditions, they allowed ETP into their neighborhood. After the company gained access, the terror began. The neighborhood was converted into a war zone. Residents were subjected to round-the-clock drilling and construction chaos. There were noxious diesel fumes all over the area, unsightly and noisy construction, sinkholes developed in their yards, drilling fluid leaked onto property, in one case 1,000 gallons, vibrations from the project cracked walls, chimneys, and driveways. The destruction ultimately lowered property value. The campaign was carried out by intrusive, non-resident workers, in addition to security guards. In April of 2017, during the Rover Pipeline construction, about 5 million gallons of drilling fluid laced with diesel fuel was dumped into a clean 500,000 square foot Ohio wetland at the Tuscarora River. The spill is destined to kill just about everything in that wetland. According to its permit, ETP Sunoco was supposed to be using only non-toxic drilling fluid. However, someone witnessed company workers adding poisonous diesel fuel before they proceeded to dump the toxic industrial material all over the area. The environment along the path of the Mariner East pipeline has been regularly spoiled since construction began in February 2017. The mayhem caused by ETP, spanning 11 Pennsylvania counties, includes the creation of sinkholes, drilling fluid spills, contaminating drinking water supplies, and polluting high-quality trout streams. I'd like to read a quote from U.S. News on ETP's destruction in Pennsylvania. The corporate developer flouted Pennsylvania environmental laws and fouled waterways and residential water supplies across hundreds of miles. The title of this report is Pipeline Developer Charged Over Systematic Contamination. Systematic meaning methodical in procedure or plan. In other words, ETP carried out planned pollution. During the 713-mile natural gas Rover Pipeline construction, from April 2017 to March 2018, ETP regularly polluted water supplies in Michigan, West Virginia, and Ohio, in addition to contaminating ponds, creeks, and wetlands in Ohio. ETP flooded farmland and caused landslides. An ETP subsidiary also tainted waterways in Grant County, Oklahoma, with crude oil in 2015. In May 2018, a Sunoco pipeline burst, spraying 630 gallons of oil over a highly populated residential area in northwest Oklahoma City. This incident, that required a hazmat team and evacuation, covered property with toxic crude oil. The following list of disasters includes a few at the start that occurred before Sunoco was merged into ETP in 2012. In February of 2000, Sunoco dumped 192,000 gallons of crude oil into the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. The leak went undetected for several days and wasn't stopped until a visitor reported it. That refuge was an important habitat for reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals, and migratory birds. About 290,000 gallons of crude oil was spilled in January 2005 by Sunoco's Mid-Valley Pipeline into the Kentucky and Ohio rivers. The same company released 153,000 gallons of crude oil near a creek in Florence, Kentucky in October 2008, causing an evacuation. It appears Sunoco relishes destroying wildlife protection areas because in March of 2014, ETP's Sunoco contaminated the sparkling pure 400-acre Oak Glen Nature Preserve in Hamilton County, southwest Ohio, with 30,000 gallons of crude oil, shutting down that nature preserve for 5 years. In October 2014, an ETP subsidiary leaked 189,000 gallons of crude oil in Caddo Parish, Louisiana, affecting a tributary of Caddo Lake. From April to December 2017, ETP's Sunoco dumped 200,000 gallons of drilling fluid into Raystown Lake, a recreational fishing lake in Huntington County, Pennsylvania, during Mariner East construction. Also during Mariner East pipeline construction, on several different occasions, Sunoco leaked industrial waste into the same creek in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. In August of 2020, during Mariner East pipeline construction, Sunoco poured 21,000 gallons of drilling fluid into the 535-acre Marsh Creek Lake in Chester County, Pennsylvania. That spill contaminated part of that recreational fishing lake. For years, this company has dumped hundreds of thousands of gallons of highly volatile liquids and crude oil in a half a dozen Texas counties. Water supplies have been contaminated. The ETP conglomerate has a firm record of pollution and destruction in Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas, routinely contaminating waterways while inflicting tens of millions of dollars in property damage. At this time, I'll read from a Sunoco ETP incident report by Waterkeeper Alliance. These incidents have resulted in releases, spills, injury and or death to a person, an emergency shutdown, explosion, fire, and or property damage all across the United States. Chevron, whose major shareholders include institutions controlled by Warren Buffett, George Soros, and the Mellon, Rockefeller, and Morgan families, is one of the most villainous industrial corporations. It and its subsidiaries frequently pollute water supplies, ruin native economies, terrorize communities, and contaminate ecosystems. This company has bankrolled national militaries to violently quell resistance to its attacks. Starting in the 1960s, Chevron waged a campaign of ecocide and genocide in the Nigerian Delta, using crude oil as a weapon of mass destruction. Chevron demolished homes, land, livelihoods, and food supplies while employing the nation's security forces to murder and torture those resisting the toxic invasion. In Kazakhstan, Chevron's extractive operations, such as flaring and persistent oil spills, have resulted in severe pollution of soil, air, and water. Those residents are all sick. The children have brain damage. In the Republic of East Timor, Chevron has been involved with the national government in murder, forced displacement, torture, rape, land confiscation, and slave labor. When Texaco, that was merged into Chevron, invaded the Ecuadorian Amazon in the 1960s, the indigenous people were initially blasted with lights and noise. Eventually, they were hit with an improvised weapon of mass destruction, that being crude oil. While genociding those people, Chevron dumped more than 16 billion gallons of toxic wastewater into the rainforest, causing a localized extinction. Those directing this ecological attack were very thorough, with pipes leading from the toxic waste pits directly into the immaculate rivers that they knew the local people were using. Crude oil proved to be a very effective weapon of mass destruction in Ecuador. The other prong of the chemical attack was the flare stacks emitting toxic fumes night and day. Because their land was the basis of their lifestyle, by contaminating it, Texaco Chevron was able to cripple these people economically, psychologically, biologically, socially, and culturally. To this day, the affected residents are suffering from various types of cancer. Birth defects and miscarriages have exploded in that region. Starting in 2011, it was reported that Chevron had been dumping crude oil off the coast of Rio de Janeiro, causing immeasurable environmental damage to the coastal zone that relies on tourism. Chevron was allegedly deceptive in its reporting of the disaster and has been criticized for conducting an erroneous cleanup. Brazilian federal prosecutors have filed criminal charges against Chevron for committing, quote, environmental crimes. Chevron, along with the government of China, has launched chemical attacks against citizens in Kazakhstan County, southwestern China. 2 major releases of toxic gas in 2003 and 2006 have caused the evacuation of tens of thousands of people, killed hundreds of people, and hospitalized thousands. While conducting a seismic survey, Chevron was able to incinerate part of the Lawachara National Park in Bangladesh in April 2008. Chevron has conducted chemical warfare against the minority residents of Richmond, California, with a series of toxic chemical releases due to equipment breakage, fires, spills, flaring, and explosions going back to 1989. The air has been so polluted that shelter-in-place advisories have been issued. Hundreds of residents have sought medical treatment because of these attacks. It was reported in February 2021 that Chevron dumped 600 gallons of diesel fuel directly into one of the best herring spawning areas in San Francisco Bay from its refinery in Richmond. This is the same weapons system that has been attacking residents with toxic fumes. Some claim that Chevron's practices precipitated the event, and its slow and ineffective cleanup worsened the damage. There are many reports of Chevron wrecking natural resources, ruining local economies, and demolishing homes in the following countries: Kazakhstan, Ecuador, Argentina, Nigeria, Ghana, America, Indonesia, Thailand, Cameroon, Chad, Angola, East Timor, China, Venezuela, Poland, Canada, Azerbaijan, Romania, and Burma, Myanmar. In addition to all-inclusive ecocide, Chevron has allegedly been carrying out acts of terrorism, murder, rape, torture, and slave labor in Thailand, Burma, Myanmar, Indonesia, Angola, China, Ghana, Cameroon, East Timor, Poland, Nigeria, Chad, Romania, and Kazakhstan. ExxonMobil. As noted in the previous chapter, some of ExxonMobil's top owners include Larry Fink's BlackRock and institutions dominated by Warren Buffett and the Mellon and Rockefeller families. Since the late 1980s, ExxonMobil has hired military units of the Indonesian Army to perpetrate human rights abuses and crimes against humanity against villagers in Aceh, western Indonesia, who resisted their extraction projects. These brutalities have included abduction, rape, torture, and murder. ExxonMobil has been accused of genocide in western Indonesia. During the Exxon Valdez disaster in March 1989, 11 million gallons of crude oil was dumped into Prince William Sound on the southern coast of Alaska. Delayed efforts to contain the spill resulted in the contamination of about 13,000 miles of untarnished Alaskan coastline. This exterminated much native wildlife, ruined livelihoods, caused bankruptcy, tainted and killed fish, and temporarily collapsed the economy of shoreline towns. The attack was also psychologically devastating, inducing anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. To this day, the affected zone hasn't fully recovered, and according to some, it never will. ExxonMobil has blitzed the people of Baltimore County, Maryland, with its weapons system in Jacksonville. A month-long leak in 2006 that dumped 25,000 gallons of gasoline, contaminated private wells, lowered property value, and traumatized and sickened hundreds of residents. Of course, the affected people were not immediately told about the spill, and Exxon was able to hide the toxic discharge for over a month, obviously in an effort to increase the environmental damage and civilian casualties caused by that weapon of mass destruction. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, ExxonMobil has been attacking residents since at least the late 1980s with explosions, toxic chemical fume discharges, and oil dumping into waterways and land. Residents of Chalmette, Louisiana, have also been the recipients of ExxonMobil strikes. The refinery in that city had a major toxic chemical release that contaminated the air with hydrogen sulfide and benzene in April 2013. The previous January, an incident at the same ExxonMobil plant splattered 15,000 gallons of crude oil over that residential area. A series of equipment failures at the same plant between July and October of 2012 released tons of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, both toxic gases. In July 2011, ExxonMobil polluted a pristine zone of the Yellowstone River in Laurel, Montana, with over 60,000 gallons of heavy crude oil, causing an evacuation. The farms and ranches along the banks of the river were contaminated. The toxic liquid traveled 240 miles in the river from the impact zone. This disaster exhibits characteristics typical of a staged event, including ignored warnings before the catastrophe, slow response, fake cleanup, information blockade, deception, severe and lasting contamination of air, soil, and water, dead wildlife, and disease among the stricken residents. In March of 2013, ExxonMobil leaked, depending on the source, between 200,000 and 500,000 gallons of heavy crude oil in Mayflower, Arkansas. 22 homes were evacuated. Land and air was contaminated with hydrogen sulfide, benzene, toluene, and other toxins. The crude oil ultimately reached Lake Conway, a fishing lake. Residents who chose to return after evacuation are sick with chronic dizziness, nosebleeds, headaches, respiratory disorders, and nausea. Hundreds of people are still suffering from these medical conditions. The impacted zone stinks horribly, and property value has been lowered. many residents permanently abandoned their contaminated property, and some areas of the impacted zone are reportedly barren. And of course, the sham cleanup. It appears ExxonMobil has been attacking farming and fishing communities in Nigeria for years with crude oil that has served as a proficient weapon of mass destruction. These chronic spills have degraded ecosystems and caused biological disease, in addition to socioeconomic wreckage. Because their lifestyle is based on their natural resources, ExxonMobil has been able to incapacitate these people by polluting their farmland and water supplies. Here's a statement by a fisherman in one impacted village. The fishermen cannot fish any longer and have no alternative means of survival. Royal Dutch Shell. In the previous chapter, we learned that Royal Dutch Shell is run by Dutch and British royalty, along with the Rothschilds, Oppenheimers, and their cohorts. Here I'll provide evidence to support my claim that Royal Dutch Shell is a global ecological warfare machine whose controllers are complicit in extreme human rights abuses and ecocide. Soil and water tests in 2008 revealed crude oil contamination in Carson, California, in LA County, on which a community complex would be constructed. Royal Dutch Shell had an underground storage tank that polluted the area with crude oil. As a result of the benzene and other deadly chemicals, 1,500 people have suffered from psychological disease, cancerous tumors, asthma, and blood disorders. Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and other corporations are aggressively polluting the North Sea with crude oil and other contaminants. Despite occasional media reports, they are allegedly poisoning these waters every day. The North Sea is a major commercial fishing spot for multiple European nations, in addition to being a critical breeding ground for a variety of animals. From its Deer Park complex in Harris County, Texas, about 20 miles east of Houston, Royal Dutch Shell violated the Clean Air Act by illegally emitting millions of pounds of volatile organic compounds and benzene into surrounding neighborhoods between 2003 and 2007. Royal Dutch Shell has a long history of working closely with the Nigerian government to suppress resistance to its campaign of pollution and genocide in the Delta. Their unconventional attacks have included deforestation, flaring, oil dumping into water supplies and farmland, and destruction of the local economy that is based on farming and fishing. Royal Dutch Shell has used the Nigerian military for a multitude of crimes against humanity, including beatings, rape, shootings, violent raids, torture, burning villages, and murder. These civilians are sick and dying. There is elevated infant mortality because the environment has been purposefully contaminated with an improvised weapon of mass destruction, crude oil. In the previous segment, we learned that ExxonMobil has also waged ecological warfare in Nigeria. The people who control these contamination dispensers use them in combination to strike targeted zones. We'll see more examples of that in this chapter. In September of 2015, Royal Dutch Shell discharged about 21,000 gallons of crude oil from its San Pablo Bay pipeline into an area that borders Alameda and San Joaquin counties in California. In May 2016, Royal Dutch Shell spilled at least 20,000 gallons from the same pipeline in the same vicinity. Both spills contaminated ranchland. Also in May of 2016, Royal Dutch Shell dumped 90,000 gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico, about 100 miles off the coast of Louisiana. This is part of the hammering of the Gulf of Mexico with improvised weapons of mass destruction. The psychopaths have also used BP to strike this target, as we'll observe in the next segment. Speaking of that, Royal Dutch Shell has teamed up with ExxonMobil to terrorize and sicken the communities in Fife County, Scotland, using the McMoRan petrochemical complex as a compound weapons system. This platform, that's situated just outside of Cowdenbeath, dispenses toxic chemicals, bright lights, turbulence, and incredibly loud noise. These attacks that have occurred over the course of 5 years are causing disease, sleep deprivation, and psychological trauma. In the Stealth Weapons chapter, we saw how light and noise are established weapons. While listening to me quote this January 2021 article from The Scotsman, please keep in mind these are the arranged effects. Communities living near the plant say vibrations and air, noise, and light pollution from the activity is having a serious impact on their lives. Losing sleep due to noises like a jet airline taking off, while the intensity of the flames is described as turning night into day. Local families have even reported children wetting their beds in terror. BP, previously known as British Petroleum, is a corporation renowned for its explosions, leaks, disasters, refusal to maintain safety equipment, and willful environmental infractions. We formally established that the committee supporting this natural resource destroyer includes the British House of Windsor, the Rothschild, Oppenheimer, and eugenic Rockefeller families, in addition to the eugenicists Warren Buffett and George Soros. BP dumped 210 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico, starting in April 2010, tainting fisheries and killing wildlife on the coast from Texas to Florida. This disaster, that was obviously planned, has threatened dozens of species with extinction, polluted food supplies, and maimed the economies of those coastal communities. The damage it caused was biological, economical, sociological, and cultural. Its psychological effects included depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and anxiety. The wildlife has still not recovered, and the crude oil has contaminated the food chain. The BP Whitting facility, that was first established as Standard Oil by the eugenicist John D. Rockefeller, has been expelling enormous pollution around Lake Michigan for over a century. This has included years of unlawful emissions. For a long time, the company has been illegally contaminating the air around Lake Michigan with the cancer-inducing agent benzene that is also deadly to plants and animals. BP has also been dumping mercury and crude oil directly into the lake. In its contamination of Lake Michigan, BP has been supported by the J.P. Morgan founded and Mellon bankrolled U.S. Steel, also located on the southern shore of Lake Michigan. You may want to have a look at this chapter's notes for more on U.S. Steel. This spoiled air, drinking water, and fish has resulted in an explosion of medical disorders exhibited by people in states around the Great Lakes. In states like Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan, there are elevated death rates from lung, colon, and breast cancer, in addition to high instances of premature birth, stunted birth weight, and infant mortality. These deaths and injuries have been attributed to PCBs, pesticides, lead, mercury, and other hazardous materials dispensed by U.S. Steel, BP, and other corporations in the Great Lakes area. In November of 2018, an independent reporter alerted us to genocide taking place at BP's colossal Tangguh gas field in Bintuni Bay, West Papua, Indonesia. Under the guise of its carefully crafted veil of corporate social responsibility, BP had been caught collaborating with the Indonesian police and military to torture and murder people resisting the occupation. In the next segment, we'll see how the subversives have also used Rio Tinto and Freeport-McMoRan in their genocidal campaign against the residents of West Papua. For years, BP has been contaminating the tundra and Beaufort Sea coast of the Alaskan North Slope with crude oil and other toxic industrial materials. BP attacked residents in Texas city of Galveston County, Texas, with toxic chemical fumes, for almost a decade and a half. Large amounts of poison, including benzene, have been released into the air for long periods, and on one occasion for over a month during equipment malfunctions. With thousands of air quality infractions at its Carson refinery in California, BP has blasted nearby communities in LA County with chemical fumes from 1991 until at least 2004. These toxic emissions have negatively impacted the health of residents, with one incident requiring the evacuation of schools. You may remember that Carson was also ground zero for Royal Dutch Shell's weapon of mass destruction that sickened 1,500 people. During the construction of the 450-mile Colombian Ocensa pipeline in the mid-1990s, BP used a variety of ecological warfare tactics against farmers along the pipeline's route. This included flooding, landslides, drought, and pollution. BP contaminated water supplies, killed livestock, suffocated food production, ruined livelihoods, and brought those people to economic destitution. BP prospered from the Colombian government's use of paramilitary forces to terrorize those resisting the pipeline. The global mining company, Rio Tinto, as we've seen, is run by the Rothschild family, with the Morgans and Warren Buffett also owning substantial shares. Rio Tinto has been causing social chaos and ruining environments in Madagascar, Papua New Guinea, Australia, Indonesia, America, Great Britain, Zimbabwe, and Canada. According to reports beginning in September 2018, Rio Tinto contaminated water supplies for thousands of people in southeast Madagascar. It appears the company used thorium, lead, and uranium as makeshift CBRNE munitions. In what some have called an act of genocide, Rio Tinto blew up the sacred Aboriginal site at Juukan Gorge in Australia in May 2020. That was both a shelter and water supply for Aboriginal people. On the island of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, Rio Tinto committed environmental violations and crimes against humanity during the operation of its Panguna mine from 1972 to 1989. These offenses include genocide, war crimes, destroying sacred sites, polluting agricultural fields, and poisoning rivers. Thousands of people have been killed. Rio Tinto used the PNG military to suppress resistance to its ecocidal and genocidal campaign. The mine was shut down in 1989 during an armed revolt by affected people who were allegedly upset that Rio Tinto contaminated their natural resources with toxic waste. These residents are now stricken with long-term medical problems, and their local economy has been destroyed. Using the Grasberg mine, Rio Tinto and Freeport-McMoRan waged ecological warfare against the indigenous residents of West Papua, Indonesia. These companies have inflicted serious human rights and environmental abuses. They dumped 1 billion tons of tailings directly into rivers that they knew the natives were using, in addition to contaminating food and water supplies. This wiped out the economy of these residents. Rio Tinto and Freeport-McMoRan paid the Indonesian military and police to abduct, torture, and murder those opposing their campaign of ecocide and genocide. Please see this chapter's notes for Freeport-McMoRan's links to elements of this criminal enterprise, such as the unconstitutional Federal Reserve, subversive think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations, semi-secret and secret societies, including Scroll and Key and Bilderberg, along with their satanic counterparts, Bohemian Grove and Skull and Bones, high-level U.S. government officials, terrorist groups like the CIA, the Rockefeller clan that has been a promoter of depopulation, and the mass murderer Dr. Henry Alfred Kissinger, who has also written about depopulation. Anglo American, founded and run by the Oppenheimers, is another intercontinental ecocide machine that, along with its subsidiaries, has left a trail of misery, death, and destruction in over a half a dozen countries. In Colombia, Anglo American benefited from the Colombian military's targeting of mining opponents. This campaign of terror included land seizure, arbitrary arrests, displacement of thousands of people, execution, pillaging, and burning houses. At the Cerrejón mine that opened in 1985 in La Guajira, Colombia, Anglo American, BHP, and Glencore operated through police and paramilitary groups to carry out human rights abuses against indigenous people. This involved beatings and routine forced displacement, including the bulldozing of at least one village. Water supplies were stolen. Because of widespread, persistent, and extreme pollution of air and water, these people and their livestock are stricken with disease. Thousands of people who resisted this brutal campaign have been executed. Reports from April and August 2021 allege that Anglo American and Glencore contaminated land and water supplies in Peru and Chile, causing all sorts of health problems that are slowly killing the indigenous communities near mining facilities. Their livestock and crops are poisoned. It seems Anglo American polluted the Colina River with lead and arsenic. So again, we find collaboration among the corporations in these murderous ecocidal campaigns. In South Africa, Anglo American teamed up with Glencore to contaminate water provisions. In addition to polluting waterways, Anglo American encroached onto farmland. The lead poisoning found among some children in South Africa has been attributed to Anglo American. When citizens launched a protest against the company, community leaders were arrested by the police. Some villagers who refused to be forcefully displaced had their water and electricity cut off. Police and private security forces in South Africa have been employed for acts of intimidation, such as threatening patrols through villages, arrests, beatings, and use of attack dogs. In Ghana, Anglo American committed severe human rights abuses. Communities around its Abiuzai gold mine have allegedly been shattered. Rivers and streams that those people used for drinking, fishing, and farming irrigation have been contaminated. Their local economies have also been impaired because of the pollution. In November 2005, Anglo American opened a pipe from a tailings storage facility that unleashed a torrent of liquid cyanide into a village, leveling houses and a large school. Anglo American used security and the police to conduct violent sweeps through villages, forcing displacement. Killings have occurred. From 1925 to 1974, Anglo American operated the Broken Hill lead mine in the once thriving town of Kabwe, Zambia. The company didn't sufficiently attempt to reduce environmental contamination when it knew in the 1940s that lead was incredibly hazardous and that its facility had completely ineffective pollution controls. Not only was the facility situated very close to villages, it was upwind from these communities. In addition, the smelter emission stacks were near the ground. That resulted in the release of deadly fumes at breathing space level. To further pollute the environment, the company dumped piles of lead tailings in the area. Anglo American ran this malicious operation for almost 50 years. Currently, the air, soil, vegetation, and water in that town is contaminated with lead. As we observed in Chapter 11, lead is a potent neurotoxin even in small amounts. In addition to inducing brain damage, it harms the liver, crosses the placenta to impede fetal development, and causes infertility and miscarriage. So it appears an ecological weapon was created, placed upwind and very close to the targeted community, then literally pointed at them. It has recently been reported that at least 100,000 children and women of childbearing age from multiple villages in Kabwe are thought to have incredibly high levels of lead in their system. Those people are all suffering from lead poisoning. The brain-damaged children are learning disabled. When you observe the outer sphere of a group run by psychopaths, you are presented with the organizational mask. that will be explained further in the group pathology segment of the next chapter. Regarding the industrial corporations mentioned in this chapter, when you visit their websites, you see pictures of smiling company workers, joyful indigenous people, and laboratory scientists conveying messages of care and well-being. Reading through their web pages, you see references to forming partnerships, strengthening host communities, and improving people's health. Guarantees are made that the community will financially and socially prosper. Projects will be done safely and in full compliance with environmental regulations. Furthermore, the companies inform us that they abide by strict ethical codes when dealing with host communities, always being open and honest. They carefully follow human rights protocols. In their literature, you'll find information about protecting the cultural heritage of indigenous people, honoring the environment, preserving water supplies. There's even a claim that peaceful resistance to unwanted projects is tolerated. To see through this organizational mask, you just need to read the mainstream media and field reports, as we've done to some extent in this chapter, and you will find out what they are really about. Land seizing, incredible pollution, social and cultural annihilation, forced displacement, terror, rape, torture, execution, mass murder, genocide, disease, psychological malignance, dreadful human rights abuses, sterilizing land, poisoning water supplies, burning houses, and destroying villages. This is the true identity of the anti-human mass murderers who direct these earth-wrecking monstrosities. This recognition of what they really are blends into the next chapter, where they will be further unmasked.